So I'll invite you to put Briedis up now. To heroic of him because he was ill yesterday, so it's great to be able to make it today.
Yeah, hi everyone. I apologize if I descend into a coughing fit during this paper. It might be a possibility, but fingers crossed it'll be okay. And I also don't have slides, so I'm very grateful for the person who did it without slides beforehand. So I hope you just enjoy listening to my 20 or so pages of text. So in the 1990s, there were a wave of student occupations across Australia contesting the imposition of neoliberalism in universities and what has been dubbed by some scholars as academic capitalism. The most notable occupations were ANU in Canberra in 1994, RMIT and UTS in 1997, in Melbourne and Sydney, and at Bankstown in Western Sydney in 1999. After a long quiescence, there was another major occupation at Sydney University's Sydney College of the Arts in 2016, which saved the faculty. So I wrote my PhD on student radicalism in Australia, and this contribution is a result of extensive research into the archives produced by the occupations, both written and oral. So I spoke to 73 student activists about their experiences, and one thing that stood out about these encounters was the deep meaning of the occupations and the rough democracy in them to their lives, well beyond just a particular moment of when the occupation happened. So one person who I interviewed, beyond just treating me to a beautiful home-cooked dinner, made the interview a family event, inviting his daughter to listen in to his war stories. Another person got up from the chair he was sitting in and started performing dramatic reenactments of key moments from student radical activity, while another activist started thumping the table emphatically, recreating an important meeting during the occupation. Others emailed me excitedly after the interview with additional facts and stories. One person simply wound up the interview by declaring, "That was my Paris commune." For ANU activist Anthony Hayes, reflecting on the thrill of genuinely collective deliberation, it was an experience in which he recalled that I lived and breathed the occupation. I remember at one point having fallen asleep on one of the benches in the Mills room, waking up and realizing that a general meeting was underway. So I put my hand up, and I'd been awake for about 10 seconds at that point. And I just thought that I would contribute because that's what you did. To me, this was like a utopia, having debates and arguments about all kinds of stuff, about what we needed to do and whether or not we could make leaflets or get bands to play or whatever. So RMIT activist Mark Cameron recalled a moment of creativity in which a movie was beamed across the street so the occupiers could watch it. He described how someone had the idea of projecting from the street up onto the opposite wall, onto RMIT, so the occupiers could see it from a window, a movie. So I don't know if it was Berkeley in the 60s or Malcolm X or something, but we watched a movie. It wasn't a completely flat surface, but there you had the rain falling in Swanson Street, the lights, the trams, and all this sort of stuff. And then this flickering film, the people watching from the window, the people down below. It was kind of magic. So these moments of meaning served as schools of dissent well beyond the glory days of the occupation itself, forging lifelong radicals and activists. They also suggest that even in distinctly non-revolutionary moments, in this case Australia of the 1990s to 2010s, directly democratic spaces can still pop up, proliferate, and serve as an example of the type of society that can be organised. Hopefully I can capture some of the incredible drama and vibrancy of these inspiring moments. I'll try and demonstrate this through a brief narrative history of two of the most important occupations, ANU and Bankstown, and then weave together some broader oral histories to wrap up. I hope that it serves as a reminder that even in totally different geographical and political circumstances, the other papers on the panel, themes of direct action and direct democracy, still resonate. So first, 1994 ANU occupation. On Thursday, September 15th, 1994, around 500 Australian National University students stormed into the Chancery Building, the main administration building on campus, and began an occupation. It was a moment of rare passion and exuberance. Anthony Hayes's personal notes, written in the immediate aftermath of the occupation, captured the thrill of the moment. 1:30, storm into Chancery. Security and admin taken off guard. Weave through ground floor and back stairs, then through third floor and up front stairs and into Mel's room, chanting all the way. Feeling ecstatic, this is really happening. Mel jumps over table, then I and others follow. Room packs out. Yes, yes, yes. Hanging up the front, speeches happen. Self comes and patronizes us to unanimous derision. Still can't believe we're here and looking to stay for a while at least. Nick off to the corner for a sip and find Hamish there with the same idea. We hug, overwhelmed, hanging out by the windows, feeling different, better. The protest was largely triggered by a proposal to introduce a $9,000 upfront fee for the subject legal workshop, an effectively compulsory postgraduate course for all law students that was necessary for them to be able to practice. The occupation would become a major focal point in the city, capturing much of Canberra's imagination. It lasted 8 days until around 4 p.m. on Friday, September 23rd, when the students were forcibly evicted by police. Ultimately, the campaign did have mixed results. While the legal workshop fee was reduced from $9,000 to $5,000, and plans for upfront postgraduate fees more generally were scrapped, the fees were not defeated in full. But the sort of joyous atmosphere inside helped create and consolidate a community of dissent in its own right, leaving a legacy in the form of a strengthened Canberra and ANU left. The occupation provided a glimpse into a form of mass democratic organisation that hinted at alternate ways of living and a break from capitalist normality. Writers have coined various concepts to describe these sort of utopian moments, from a festival of the oppressed to a moment of excess and a temporary autonomous zone. In this vein, participants in the occupation most frequently portrayed it as a moment of what was described as full-on fucking direct democracy, where decisions were made collectively by those involved rather than by delegates or elected representatives. The main structure to facilitate this were general meetings of 100 to 200, which became the prime decision-making space for the occupation. General meetings were set twice daily at 10 a.m. and 5:30 p.m, held in the ANU Council's very own chamber on the top floor. For some, even time itself seemed to expand. Alison Dellett, a participant and media spokesperson, described how it was only a week and I talk about it like it was a year. It really did feel like a long period of time, that occupation. One aspect of the Chancery architecture that immediately stood out was its patriarchal design. Emma Robertson recalled how one of the things that we were astounded about when we went into the building was that the male bathrooms were massive and beautiful and had showers, and the female bathrooms were a little pokey toilet. That the whole building was clearly physically designed with women's secretaries in mind. Therefore, they declared an anti-sexist toilet arrangement with everyone able to use the men's. The occupiers agreed to avoid damaging property in the space. In fact, Alison Dellett, now a librarian, recalls how this is partly the librarian archivist in me that was amazed at this, but it was good. One of the first things that people did was organise plastic sheetings to go over all of the heritage furniture in the room. There was a very big sense of not that we're here to destroy things, but we're here to occupy and reclaim the space. So there was a lot of, you could call it rules, but they were collectively developed rules about what you could and couldn't do with the space. As Dellett suggests, the idea that they were not there to destroy things, but as part of a collective creating something together was key. In this directly democratic spirit, it was quickly agreed the negotiating committee with the university had no power to make decisions on its own, and that everything had to be ratified through the general meetings. While leadership did exist, to some extent this culture permeated the everyday life of the occupation as well. Haynes recalled that it was an experience and a type of mass democracy. Yeah, at the time I just liked so much being alive during the occupation. Now I feel like all I can do is kind of shit on the memory of it by trying to describe it to a point. There was a type of engagement that I had never really come across in everyday life before. I'd sort of come across it to a limited extent in radical artistic practice and political practice. I was in the left ghetto, but in the occupation, it was more expansive. Suddenly, we went from being this little ghetto of 5 or 10 people to a few hundred. I'm not trying to say that the occupation is the Paris Commune, but it was certainly a lot more interesting than the type of everyday life that most of us were leading both before and after. Protest in this case was not merely about challenging power, but about creating new ways of being alive and relating to one another. As Hayes reflected, these moments were so intimate, poignant, and beautiful that even finding a vocabulary to describe them is difficult and can chip on the memory of it. Sadly, however, the occupation had to come to an end. On Friday, September 23, the university called the police. Using a sledgehammer, they battered down the unlocked back door and entered the building. The ACT police had called in reinforcements from New South Wales Police Rescue, and as Police Rescue was a highly popular TV show at the time, chants of "rescue us from thieves" rang out among the occupiers. The activists marched out amidst hugs and tears. They then marched through Civic, the city centre of Canberra. The Department of Education, Employment and Training building was unprotected, with an entrance at the back slightly ajar, so they entered and occupied the secretary's office for a short time. By this stage, they were exhausted, so they left and regrouped at one of the main student bars and began celebrating their success. Next, I'll talk about the 1999 Bankstown occupation. At about 2 p.m. on Wednesday, October 27th, 1999, at the University of Western Sydney's Macarthur Bankstown campus, around 100 students began an occupation of the student centre. It would last 14 days until midday on November 10th, when the university would concede defeat, signing a 6-page agreement with the occupiers that conceded to 27 demands. The activists had run a union-style log of claims campaign in which they surveyed as many students as possible, investigating what students thought the main problems of the university were, which were then drawn into a series of demands. At their heart, these were about class, about the imposition of significant costs on the working class students that affected both their immediate experience of life on campus and the availability of quality education for disproportionately working class communities in Western Sydney more generally. Throughout the campaign, collective decision-making was vital. Instead of politicised students separate from the student body, deciding on a list of demands of their own. Michael Thorne, a UWS student and participant in the occupation, recalled that the log of claims was just people getting blank sheets and filling out what they hated about the uni, what was getting in the way of their studies. The important thing was that it was all pulled together and that it was done justice. Once pulled together, you can have a log of claims that was expressing exactly what people were saying. You could very easily change it around, change the wording and make it sound different. I think because of that, students at Bankstown felt a sense of ownership over the action and the log of claims campaign. The occupation itself was a radicalising, exhilarating and inspiring event for those involved, a utopian moment like the 1994 occupation of ANU. When we charged into the administration building, rendered Thorne, that was the moment that radicalised me. Brandon Villa, the level of solidarity and camaraderie revealed glimpses of another world, a very communal existence, a very communist existence. After the occupation, Villa recalled, even though they had won, people felt quite sad as the space no longer existed. I remember very clearly having conversations with people I didn't know prior to the occupation. We'd become almost like family. And we were sitting around having a coffee and smoking some cigarettes. And this female student said, "What do we do now? I just don't want to go back to regular life." It was a moment of transcending normality, so that even the very demands of the occupation became marginal. Importantly, a second case study of occupation helped show that ANU and Bankstown were not one-off exceptional events, but the utopian dimension was a recurring feature of student activism. What was life in the occupation like? Like Villa's reflections, numerous interviewees attest to a strong feeling of camaraderie and solidarity in the occupation, and how important this was in sustaining it over the 14 days. While there was an informal leadership group consisting of some of the office bearers like Villa, emphasis was placed on making the space as democratic and inclusive as possible, which helped facilitate this. Progressive speaking lists were introduced, and key meetings were remote, all in collective meetings. This democratic culture was perhaps taken to extremes at times. Julie Sloggett, for instance, remembered meetings that continued for hours, with speaking lists of up to 50 that no one would cut off because everyone had to have their say, even if they were repeating what the person 15 speakers ago said. Importantly, politically inexperienced students were encouraged to take initiative. In one passionate 3-page email to the National Broad Left list, which was in 1999 the main list for left-wing student activists in Australia, Richard Martino stressed on these lines that the old myth that you can't rely on people who have not had the experience in student politics is absolute bullshit. We had students who had never done media releases before in their life doing media release interviews. Perhaps the standard was not at the highest level imaginable, but the importance of giving students ownership over building action is perhaps the most liberating experience for them. As the days went by, feelings of camaraderie amongst the occupiers gradually built up. Andrew Beer recalled one incredible story of how a really angry, aggressive, fairly large bloke came at the occupation quite suddenly, and he started ranting that we were disrupting his learning, and he didn't give a fuck about this and that. It was really full on. And he was a big guy, and Jorge was a Chilean refugee, basically, a queer activist, socialist, about 5 foot tall, and he confronted this guy who just jumped at him and started screaming. And this policing student, who was about 6'4" tall, stepped in and put his hand around Jorge and basically confronted this massive dude. And he says, "Stay away from my mate unless you want some," which shows this real transition. We're talking about a guy who used to be in the army, was a policing student, was kind of ochre and blokey as they would come. And through the occupation, we developed this amazing bond. And he was protecting this queer, small Chilean dude from this really aggressive dude. And then after the moment, he grabbed the red National Union of Students flag, put it on his shoulder, and marched up and down in front of him in this act of like, this is where I am and this is where I belong. Through the practice of occupation, seemingly impermeable barriers between students is different as a queer small Chilean dude and an ochre and blokey policing student could be broken down. New identities were forged in the struggle. This is where I am, this is where I belong. Soon after this, the university conceded defeat. So the occupations had ripple effects. Perhaps most memorably, from September to November 2001, there was an occupation of Gullingulia, the Aboriginal education space at Bankstown campus. Western Sydney University had planned to end the Indigenous unit at Bankstown and at the other campuses, rolling back the course and centralising everything into one program at Blacktown. Inspired by their earlier success, an occupation occurred, and it was successful in winning its demands as well. Similarly, the ANU campaign catalysed a nationwide struggle in the mid-90s against the imposition of fees, reviving student activism for a time. A wave of occupations eventuated in 1997, which catalysed a student left that was key to driving campaigns, such as the successful 1998 blockade of the Jabilupi uranium mine. Others reflected that the occupation showed them how another world was possible. Of the 2016 SCA campaign, Tandway Batoon reflected that that's almost the most beautiful part of the campaign to me. My mind is totally blown over this 6 months about how the world could work. There was a genuine belief that the collective knowledge of the group was superior to the knowledge of any one person. Even if you were wrong or you lost an argument, it was good to lose the argument because it was better for the group. It was a genuine kind of democracy for the success of the campaign and the success of ideas. It was the most transformative experience of my life in terms of shaping the person who I am today. It was a conversation with people about politics, about how the world could work, and really fleshing that out. There's no reason we couldn't be running society the way we're running the occupation or this campaign. There's no reason we have to live in a world that's exclusive. Even if SCA was just this microcosm of the world, I was able to go, all right, we could replicate this on a bigger scale. This political reality nurtured an intensity and a seriousness to what we did. It brought out our dedication. Of Bankstown, Amy McMurtry summed up that most people there had never experienced anything like that. There was a real sense that it would own the campus. We don't know what it's like now, but the student centre was in the middle. Most people had to walk through there to go anywhere. There was a sense of we really did feel like we were in control, that students were in control. There was such a sense of momentum that things were really going somewhere, that we were powerful. Well, of course, the feeling that we owned the campus was a temporary one, and the demands won by the occupiers were gradually stripped back, a moment that illuminates how rebellion can be a joyous, inspiring moment of collectivity, not based on guilt, sacrifice, and responsibility, seems worth remembering, both as history in its own terms and as a way of shifting our political horizons and perspectives.
Thank you.
It's amazing. And you're describing something that sounds like a distinct culture of student applications. I'm wondering about the point of all this.
Of the occupations.
Yeah, like where did this idea, you got these dates,
Okay, well, I can go into a long detailed history about the origins of occupations in Australia. And obviously there's a global history, so the kind of the pivotal moment that people were looking back at in the 94 occupation were the 70s occupations. And so there was actually like a direct link between the two. So in 74, there was an occupation at Flinders University, which is in South Australia. And that was, to that point, the longest occupation of an administration building in Australian history. Like it was to do with the history department and like basically trying to make assessment more democratic and stuff like that. And then actually the uni, the lecturers hired a bunch of security to smash up the occupation, and apparently some of the lecturers themselves joined the attack. So it was quite dramatic in some ways. But anyway, there was one person who was at the Flinders Uni occupation, who became a security guard, unionist, who happened to be in Canberra at the time in the 94 occupation, and gave a speech to them about the lessons learned from the Flinders occupation and kind of what you could do right. And because of his involvement, he managed to get security guards to act as like what they called a neutral witness. So they weren't, so they was proven that the students weren't destroying property in the occupation, which was quite clever. Yeah, and that was because, and there was another link to the 74 ANU occupation also in Canberra, where the people like this guy Humphrey McQueen, who's quite a well-known Australian historian, he was at that, and he also came to the 94 occupation and passing on the lessons. So yeah, the history essentially comes from the 70s, and then people were like really quite directly drawing the links between what happened then and what was happening in the 90s as well. So ANU, and yes, continuing to expand on your question, because I know so much about this. So 94 was like the big one and like getting things going in the 90s in Australia. There were a couple of smaller occupations before it, like the Macquarie in Sydney had one in 92. And there was like there were two occupations, they were both 2 days. And that was important, but really the ANU one got things going and revitalised the movement. And then in 97, there was a huge wave of occupations across the country. Yeah.
Super. That was lovely to hear about these transformation processes in these occupations. And I'm curious about a couple of things. So the one thing is like there is a lovely book by Sasha Rosner about Greenland Common. And one of the quotes is that Greenland Common changed my life. And so I think that resonates very much with what you just described. And so on the one hand, what is really curious is what happened to the people who were involved? Are they now involved in different struggles? You know that. And the other thing, which I also think is interesting, so if the small Chilean group would not have been defended, what might have happened? And have there also been people who were disgruntled or didn't feel so included or held by the movement? Because this is a love story, basically. And the question is, are there also people who are not so loved?
Yeah, that's a great question. Series of questions. So the Greenland Common stories, I think that really relates to her work really sharply. And yeah, just that so many people have like come up, have continued to do amazing things after the occupation. So I did try and ask people about what they were doing in their lives, today, what they did since, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was an immediate, like really direct link between occupiers and things happening in the Australian left. So the Jabiluka protest, which was against post-uranium mine, and there was a huge blockade of that in 1998. And that was partly enabled because it was a really strong student movement. People gained a confidence in things because of occupations that happened. So it's no coincidence that there was this wave of student occupation in 97 and then a big blockade of during Jabiluka in 98. And then like going on to today, like I've been talking to people who've been heavily involved in Palestine stuff, in particular, and organising internal unions. Those are the two main ones. Anthony Hayes, who I mentioned a few times in this in talk, kind of went through a period of political inactivity for a while, but then I visited him recently in Canberra. He's heavily involved in the Gaza solidarity movement and throwing himself into it. So it's very, and that's like the story that inspired him was the end of the occupation. That was his moment, really. So yeah, there is a real continuity, I think. So in my thesis, I kind of argued that like these occupations were schools of dissent, and it's really easy just to focus on like the specific campaign that's going on, but not the broader impact. Like is the focus on like whether campaign wins or loses, but not so much like that long-term impact. Yeah, I think that's your question to extent.
We've got time for one more from me. Quick question. So a lot of it sounds like a lot of the interaction between the students and the university kind of seem to be almost kind of self-contained. I'm kind of wondering what, if any, role kind of the broader political party system or other institutions might have played. Just for example, Chile, for example, a lot of the student activism is organized through political parties. So we have basically student leadership groups, but they have kind of political alignment, and it's basically kind of a training ground for the parties. You will see that, for example, in the congregation of Chile, they come out of the student movement, and now they're in the development. So was there an interaction between the kind of more formal political institutions, or is this more or less contained within the university system?
So the student unions do have a very strong historic links to the Labor Party in Australia. There are strong Labor factions, both Labor right and Labor left. Labor right kind of being notorious for undermining as much activism as they possibly can. But certainly Labor left people were involved in this like 1990s period of activism. In the occupations, not so much. Like both ANU and Bankstown were kind of distinct because they basically had no student activist culture before these occupations. They had a little bits and pieces, but like compared to say Sydney Uni or Melbourne Uni, that they had far less. And actually that was an advantage of it for the occupiers because the university was completely taken by surprise. So in 94, yeah, ANU had an occupation in 20 years. In Bankstown, they had at Western Sydney, they had one major protest in the mid-90s, which kind of scared the admin, but they hadn't really had much before, and it's known as being a totally apolitical campus before this. So yeah, my answer is yes, there is a link, but it wasn't that important in kind of these case studies. Yeah.
You may have, it was a quick one from my
Just go like very quick question. I was listening and I just was thinking about Joe Lawrence, like the utopian performative concept and how feelings of those gatherings are brought up into the later life after the pushing end and how they keep mobilizing people to recreate them again. Did you notice something like that? If people just wanted to feel that way again?
Absolutely. Yeah, they really do. So so many little details that could have been in this paper I didn't have a chance to speak about. But so in 97, there was another attempt to occupy ANU, and one of the people I spoke about gave this incredible story about how he was thrown into the ANU Chancellor building by another activist, by a small group, and he was frozen. And he described his story as like, yeah, it's like 94, ANU, 94, rant again. And like he started like getting up and like demonstrating this to me as he was telling me his story. So yeah, they very much wanted to replicate it. But of course the tragedy is like you can't really replicate political tactics again all the time. A lot of the time the state prepares for it. And so in that case, basically the cops were inside the building when he was inside the chancery. So he got inside the chancery trying to open the door from the inside and pick up people getting in. But the cops were actually proclaiming for people inside the building. So he gets in, then he stares at like a dozen massive police officers. They all jump on top of him, and he gets taken away. And then both hilariously and tragically, or potentially tragically, the cops forget to like lock the back of the patioway. They're taking it away. So he could like quite easily have fallen out of the car and like seriously injured himself. So the student activists had to stage a protest out like in front of the police alleyway and taking it away. Be like, oh no, Jerry could be hurt, Jerry could be hurt. And they then get arrested, but they're able to tell the cops to close the door. So then like a whole array of students end up in jail and apparently they're singing songs to one another and just like, yeah, children so much. It definitely turned people got experience of going to jail, turned into a much happier visual on that. Yeah.